They told you Elizabeth I was beautiful, her face a perfect white mask of divine power and eternal youth. But that flawless porcelain skin wasn't makeup. It was poison. For 45 years, she painted lead and arsenic onto her face every single morning, and by the time she died, the mask had eaten through to her skull. What they found when they peeled it off her corpse was so horrifying, they sealed her in lead within hours and have kept the truth buried for 400 years. Want to know what it feels like to paint poison directly onto your face every single morning for 45 years straight? Elizabeth I knew exactly what that felt like, because the white mask that made her look like a goddess was literally killing her with every application. The substance was called Venetian ceruse, and if you think that sounds elegant and harmless, wait until you hear what it was actually made from. White lead carbonate mixed with vinegar to create a thick, acidic paste. But that wasn't toxic enough for Tudor beauty standards, so they often added arsenic to make it stick better to the skin and last longer throughout the day. Yes, you heard that correctly. Lead and arsenic, the two most lethal substances you could possibly smear onto your face, applied fresh every morning like clockwork. This wasn't some accidental poisoning where people didn't know better. They knew. Medical texts from the era warned explicitly that lead was dangerous, that it caused madness and sickness and death. Alchemists understood its toxic properties. Physicians cautioned against its use. But the beauty standard demanded that ghostly white complexion, that porcelain perfection that separated aristocrats from common people who worked outdoors and had tanned skin. And only lead-based ceruse could achieve that specific shade of deathly pale white that signified nobility, purity, and divine right to rule. The recipe for Venetian ceruse was actually quite specific and had been refined over centuries of use across European courts. You take thin sheets of lead and suspend them over vinegar in sealed pots, letting the acidic fumes corrode the metal slowly over weeks. The lead would develop a white crust of lead carbonate, which you'd then scrape off carefully and grind into an extremely fine powder using a mortar and pestle. This powder was then mixed with more vinegar and sometimes egg whites to create a thick paste with the consistency of modern foundation, but far heavier and more opaque. The smell was distinctly metallic and acidic, sharp enough to make your eyes water if you got too close to a fresh batch being prepared. Some recipes called for adding ground pearls or bismuth to make it shimmer slightly in candlelight, creating an even more ethereal appearance. Others included small amounts of mercury or additional arsenic compounds that would make the paste adhere more tenaciously to skin, preventing it from sliding off in the heat of crowded court gatherings. The texture was gritty and uncomfortable, nothing like the smooth cosmetics we use today. It felt heavy on the skin, like wearing a plaster mask that would crack and flake with every facial expression. Women who wore it described feeling their faces stiffen as it dried, making smiling or frowning physically difficult without breaking the surface and revealing the skin beneath. Elizabeth didn't just use this poison casually or occasionally for special events. This was her daily armor, her constant companion, her necessary disguise. Every single morning for 45 years meant approximately 16,425 individual applications of this toxic paste directly onto her skin. Think about that number. 16,425 times, she allowed her ladies to paint lead and arsenic onto her face, knowing full well it was harmful, knowing it was slowly destroying her, but unable to stop because the alternative was worse. The sheer dedication to this deadly ritual speaks to the impossible position she was in. Each application added more poison to her system, more lead that would never leave her bones, more damage that could never be undone. The lead from the very first application when she was a young woman, just crowned queen in 1558, was still in her body when she died in 1603. Lead doesn't break down. It doesn't metabolize. It accumulates, building up year after year, creating a growing toxic burden that her body struggled desperately to manage and ultimately failed to eliminate. But here's what makes this even more horrifying than you might realize. The poison wasn't just sitting on the surface of her skin like a dangerous but contained substance. How exactly does lead destroy a human body from the inside out? Let's talk about the actual science of what was happening to Elizabeth every single day, because understanding the mechanism makes the horror even more real. When you apply lead-based substances to your skin, especially damaged skin or skin that's been deliberately stripped of its protective oils, the lead begins absorbing through your pores almost immediately. The rate of absorption increases dramatically if the skin has any cuts, abrasions, or existing damage, which Elizabeth's face definitely did after decades of this treatment. Once the lead enters your bloodstream through dermal absorption, it travels throughout your entire body, hitching rides on red blood cells and distributing itself to every organ system. Lead has an insidious property that makes it especially dangerous. It mimics calcium in your body. Your cells can't tell the difference between lead ions and calcium ions, so when your body tries to use calcium for essential functions, it sometimes grabs lead instead. This is catastrophic because calcium is involved in virtually everything your body does. Nerve signal transmission, muscle contraction, bone formation, enzyme activation, hormone secretion, all of these critical processes can be disrupted when lead substitutes for calcium. Your bones become repositories for lead, incorporating it into their structure as if it were calcium, where it can remain for decades, slowly leaching back out into your bloodstream and repoisoning you long after the initial exposure. The neurological effects of chronic lead poisoning were particularly devastating and became increasingly obvious as Elizabeth aged. Lead crosses the blood-brain barrier easily, a protective membrane that's supposed to keep toxins out of your central nervous system, but treats lead as if it were a harmless substance. Once in the brain, lead interferes with neurotransmitter function, the chemical signals that allow brain cells to communicate with each other. It disrupts the release and uptake of neurotransmitters like dopamine and glutamate, creating imbalances that affect mood, memory, impulse control, and cognitive function. This explains Elizabeth's legendary mood swings that became more extreme as the years passed. Courtiers learned to read her moods carefully because she could shift from charming and witty to violently angry in seconds. There are documented incidents of her throwing objects at ministers during council meetings, including the famous occasion when she hurled a slipper at a councillor's head for disagreeing with her. She slapped ladies in waiting across the face for minor mistakes, screamed at servants until they wept, and then would become remorseful and confused about why she'd reacted so intensely. These weren't character flaws or the temperamental outbursts of a stressed monarch. These were her brain misfiring because lead had damaged the neural pathways that regulate emotional responses and impulse control. The irritability, the rage, the inability to moderate her reactions, all classic symptoms of chronic lead neurotoxicity, progressively destroying her frontal lobe function. Lead also attacks your kidneys with brutal efficiency, and kidney damage creates a cascade of additional health problems throughout your entire body. The kidneys are responsible for filtering waste products from your blood and maintaining proper fluid and electrolyte balance. When lead damages the delicate tubular structures inside your kidneys, they become less efficient at their job, allowing toxins to build up in your bloodstream while simultaneously losing essential nutrients and proteins through your urine. Elizabeth's constant complaints of severe abdominal pain, her inability to tolerate food, her progressive weakness, all consistent with declining kidney function. The pain she experienced wasn't vague or mild. Multiple sources describe her clutching her stomach and pushing food away after just a few bites, unable to eat because the pain was too intense. Chronic kidney damage also causes anemia because damaged kidneys can't produce enough erythropoietin, the hormone that signals your bone marrow to make red blood cells. Anemia leads to fatigue, weakness, pale skin that ironically made the white makeup seem more necessary, and decreased stamina. By her 50s and 60s, Elizabeth struggled with physical activities that had been easy in her youth. She needed help standing after sitting for extended periods. She tired quickly and needed frequent rests. Her famous energy and physical vigor slowly drained away as her poisoned kidneys failed to keep her blood clean and her body functioning properly. But the physical damage was only part of the horror story. Every morning for 45 years, Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting performed the same deadly ceremony with ritualistic precision. The process started long before the actual application of the ceruse, and every step of this elaborate routine added to the cumulative damage being inflicted on the queen's skin and body. First, they would prepare her face by washing it with an acidic preparation, typically a mixture containing wine vinegar, white wine, and sometimes lemon juice or other citrus extracts. This acidic wash served a specific purpose in Tudor beauty theory. It was supposed to remove any residual oils from the skin and create a smooth, receptive surface for the makeup to adhere to properly. But what it actually did was strip away the skin's natural protective barrier, the lipid layer that keeps moisture in and pathogens and toxins out. By deliberately destroying this protective barrier every single morning, they were ensuring that the lead and arsenic in the ceruse would absorb even more efficiently into Elizabeth's bloodstream. Her skin never had a chance to recover never had a day to rebuild its natural defenses because the next morning would bring another acidic wash, stripping everything away again. The sensation was probably intensely uncomfortable, a burning, tightening feeling as the acid worked on her already damaged skin. But discomfort was irrelevant compared to achieving the perfect appearance. After the acidic preparation came the actual application of the Venetian ceruse, and this process alone could take 2 to 3 hours depending on how elaborate the final look needed to be for that day's activities. The ladies would start with a base layer using soft brushes or small sponges made from natural materials to spread the thick white paste across Elizabeth's entire face, down her neck, across her décolletage, anywhere that would be visible in her elaborate gowns. They worked carefully but had to move relatively quickly because the paste would begin drying and stiffening within minutes of application. Once the first layer was in place, they'd wait for it to dry partially, then add another layer, building up the opacity and thickness to achieve that perfect porcelain finish. Sometimes 3 or 4 layers were necessary, especially in Elizabeth's later years when she needed to cover increasing damage to the skin beneath. The weight of all those layers was substantial. Imagine wearing a plaster mask that covers your entire face and neck, something that adds noticeable weight to your head and restricts your facial movements. That's what Elizabeth wore every day. The paste would settle into every line, every pore, every tiny crack in her damaged skin, creating a smooth white surface that looked flawless from a distance, but felt suffocating and alien up close. As it dried completely, it would harden and crack slightly with any facial movement, so Elizabeth learned to keep her face relatively immobile when she wore the full ceremonial makeup. The most insidious aspect of this daily routine was how it created a self-reinforcing cycle of damage that became impossible to escape. When Elizabeth finally removed the makeup at night, typically using oils and cloths, the removal process itself was harsh and damaging. The ceruse had dried into a hard crust that didn't come off easily. The ladies would have to rub and scrub to remove all traces, further irritating and damaging her skin. Then in the morning, the acidic wash would strip away any healing that might have occurred overnight, and the whole deadly process would begin again. Her skin never had a chance to recover properly, never had time to heal the microabrasions and chemical burns being inflicted daily. Over months and years, this constant cycle of damage and redamage meant her facial skin was in a perpetual state of inflammation and injury. The skin barrier broke down more and more, becoming thinner, more fragile, more permeable to the toxins she kept applying. Normal, healthy skin has remarkable defensive capabilities, but Elizabeth's skin lost those defenses early in her reign and never regained them. By her 30s, her skin was already showing signs of damage. By her 40s, the damage was significant. By her 50s, it was becoming difficult to conceal. And by her 60s, the horror beneath the mask was so extreme that even the toxic ceruse couldn't hide it anymore. The first symptoms of chronic lead poisoning appeared gradually, so subtly at first that nobody connected them to the daily application of makeup. Elizabeth began experiencing severe headaches in her 30s, vicious migraines that would strike without warning and leave her incapacitated for hours or even days. These weren't ordinary headaches that you could push through with some willow bark tea and determination. These were skull-crushing episodes of pain that made light unbearable, sound torture, movement impossible. When the headaches struck, Elizabeth would retreat to her private chambers and demand absolute darkness and silence. Her ladies would draw the heavy curtains, extinguish all candles except perhaps one small flame far from the bed, and speak only in whispers when necessary. She'd lie there with cold compresses on her forehead, sometimes for 10 or 12 hours, waiting for the pain to subside enough that she could function again. The headaches followed a pattern consistent with lead neurotoxicity affecting blood flow in the brain and causing inflammation of neural tissues. Lead constricts blood vessels in the brain erratically, creating pressure and pain. It also causes inflammation of the meninges, the protective membrane surrounding the brain, which generates intense headache pain. As the years passed and the lead accumulated in her system, the headaches became more frequent and more severe, evolving from occasional nuisances to regular occurrences that significantly impacted her ability to govern. The abdominal pain started around the same time as the headaches, but was even more debilitating in its own way because it affected her ability to eat and maintain basic nutrition. Elizabeth's stomach problems became legendary at court. She would sit down to elaborate feasts with dozens of courses, and courtiers would watch her push food around her plate, taking perhaps 1 or 2 small bites before pushing the entire thing away with a grimace of pain. Her ladies reported that she'd clutch her stomach suddenly during meals, her face contorting with discomfort, and excuse herself from the table. The pain was described as cramping, sharp, and relentless, the kind of pain that makes you double over and can't be ignored. This is classic lead colic, a syndrome caused by lead's effects on the gastrointestinal system. Lead damages the smooth muscle in your intestines, causing painful spasms and contractions. It also interferes with the nerves that regulate digestion, creating dysfunction in the normal movement of food through your system. The result is severe cramping, constipation alternating with diarrhea, nausea, and a constant feeling of gastrointestinal distress. Elizabeth's inability to eat properly meant she was chronically undernourished, which compounded all her other health problems. Malnutrition weakens your immune system, slows healing, causes muscle wasting, and accelerates the damage from other toxins because your body lacks the nutrients it needs to mount defensive responses. She was trapped in another vicious cycle where the poison prevented proper nutrition, and the lack of nutrition made her more vulnerable to the poison's effects. By her 40s, Elizabeth was experiencing joint pain and progressive muscle weakness that made physical activities increasingly difficult. Her legs were particularly affected. Courtiers noted that she struggled with stairs, taking them slowly and carefully, sometimes needing to pause and rest halfway up. After sitting for extended periods during long council meetings or court ceremonies, she needed assistance to stand, her ladies supporting her arms as she rose stiffly from her chair. The famous energy and physical vigor she'd possessed as a young queen slowly drained away, replaced by this creeping weakness that made her feel older than her years. Lead causes this specific pattern of weakness by damaging peripheral nerves, the nerves that connect your spinal cord to your muscles. This condition, called peripheral neuropathy, means the signals from your brain don't reach your muscles efficiently, so they don't contract with full strength. It also causes pain in joints because lead deposits in the joints themselves and causes inflammation and damage to cartilage. Elizabeth's hands were affected too, though she tried to hide it. She developed a slight tremor that became more noticeable as she aged, her hands shaking subtly when she held documents or gestured while speaking. The tremor, the weakness, the pain, all classic signs of lead neurotoxicity destroying the connection between her brain and her muscles, stealing her physical capability inch by inch, year by year. But perhaps the most terrifying symptoms were the cognitive and psychological changes that became increasingly obvious to those close to Elizabeth as the decades of lead exposure accumulated. The mood swings were one thing, dramatic, invisible, and impossible to ignore. But the memory problems were more insidious and more frightening because they struck at the core of who Elizabeth was, her legendary intelligence and sharp wit. She began forgetting conversations she'd had just hours earlier. Counselors learned to repeat important information because they couldn't be sure she'd remember it from one meeting to the next. She'd sometimes start telling a story and then trail off mid-sentence, confused about where she'd been going with it. Names that should have been instantly familiar would escape her temporarily, leaving her grasping for words that had once come effortlessly. This is frontotemporal dementia, caused by chronic lead exposure, the progressive damage to the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain that control memory formation, recall, and executive function. Lead physically damages neurons, killing them or impairing their function, and dead neurons in the brain don't regenerate. Every year of exposure meant more dead neurons, more cognitive decline, more of Elizabeth's formidable mind being eaten away by the poison she wore on her face. The woman who had mastered multiple languages, who could debate theology with scholars, and outwit the cleverest diplomats in Europe, was slowly losing the mental acuity that had been her greatest weapon. And she knew it was happening. That might have been the most horrible part, being aware that her mind was slipping, that the thoughts didn't come as quickly as they used to, that memories were becoming foggy and unreliable. Then came the visible damage, the point where the poison could no longer be hidden beneath more applications of the same substance that was causing the destruction. By her 60s, Elizabeth had developed patches of necrotic tissue on her face and neck, areas where the lead had literally killed the skin cells and caused the flesh to die and turn black. Necrosis is tissue death, the point where cells have been so damaged they can no longer function and begin to rot while still attached to your living body. The patches started small, perhaps just a few darkened spots that could be covered with extra makeup. But they grew larger and more numerous as the years passed, and the cumulative damage reached critical levels. The blackened areas would appear first as dark purple or brown discoloration, but would progress to actual black necrotic tissue that had the texture and appearance of leather or burnt skin. These weren't bruises or temporary marks. This was permanent damage. Dead tissue that would never heal or regenerate because the cells were completely destroyed. Around the necrotic patches, the skin would become red and inflamed, ulcerated areas that wept clear or yellowish fluid constantly. These open sores were incredibly painful and refused to heal no matter what remedies her physicians tried. They'd apply every treatment known to Tudor medicine, herbal poultices, salves made from various substances, even more exotic preparations imported from distant lands. Nothing worked because you can't heal tissue that's been poisoned at the cellular level by heavy metal toxicity. The lead had damaged the DNA in her skin cells, preventing normal cell division and repair mechanisms from functioning. The smell became another problem that no amount of perfume or herbs could adequately mask. Necrotic tissue smells distinctly of rot and decay because that's literally what's happening at the cellular level. The dead cells are breaking down and bacteria are feeding on the damaged tissue, producing the characteristic smell of infection and putrefaction. Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting would have noticed this smell daily when they attended her in close quarters, helping her dress, doing her hair, applying and removing the makeup. Court documents and letters from the period hint at this in carefully euphemistic language, referring to unpleasant odors in the queen's chambers that required constant burning of incense and perfumes. Foreign ambassadors visiting the court mentioned the heavy use of scented candles and herbs throughout the palace, suggesting there was something being covered up. The psychological impact on Elizabeth of having rotting flesh on her face must have been devastating. She was a woman who had built her entire public image on the illusion of divine perfection, eternal youth, and otherworldly beauty. Now she had to confront the reality of her face literally decomposing while she was still alive, still ruling, still needing to maintain that image of invincible power. The only solution was to apply more makeup, thicker layers, heavier coverage. But of course, that's what created this nightmare in the first place. This is where the death spiral truly became inescapable, a horrifying trap of Elizabeth's own making that she couldn't escape no matter how desperately she might have wanted to. The worse the damage to her face became, the more ceruse she needed to cover it adequately. More ceruse meant more lead and arsenic absorbing into her already catastrophically poisoned system. More poison meant more damage to her skin and internal organs. More damage meant she needed even more makeup to hide it. Round and round, an accelerating cycle of destruction, where each attempt to conceal the problem made the problem exponentially worse. By her final years, Elizabeth was applying some of the thickest, heaviest applications of ceruse she'd ever worn, trying desperately to cover the black necrotic patches and red weeping sores beneath. Her ladies would pack the makeup into the damaged areas, building up layers until the surface looked relatively smooth and uniform from a distance. But the weight of all that toxic paste was substantial, and her damaged skin could barely support it. The makeup would crack and flake more easily because it was sitting on top of dead, fragile tissue instead of healthy living skin. So they'd have to repair and reapply multiple times throughout the day, adding even more poison every time. Elizabeth was drowning in the very substance she'd used to project power and immortality, suffocating beneath the mask that had become her prison and her executioner. Why couldn't she just stop? Why didn't Elizabeth simply wash off the poison and let her face heal, even if it meant appearing damaged and scarred? Because for Elizabeth, the mask wasn't vanity or personal preference. It was survival in the most literal political sense. Every public appearance was a high-stakes performance where any sign of weakness would be noted, analyzed, and weaponized by her enemies, both foreign and domestic. Spain had been waiting for decades for an excuse to invade England and restore Catholicism by force, and the aging or illness of Elizabeth would provide the perfect opportunity. Philip II had already sent the Spanish Armada once. He'd gladly send another if he thought England's queen was too weak to defend her realm effectively. Catholic assassins and conspirators within England were constantly plotting, waiting for the right moment when Elizabeth seemed vulnerable to strike and install a Catholic monarch. Her own Protestant nobles, while generally loyal, were still calculating their positions and succession plans, evaluating whether they'd be better served by supporting Elizabeth or preparing for her replacement. The Virgin Queen mythology she'd built was powerful political magic, transforming her unmarried, childless status from a liability into evidence of divine favor and superhuman dedication to England. But that mythology required the visual component of ageless, perfect beauty to function properly. A sick, aging, disfigured Elizabeth would shatter the illusion and invite every predator circling England to attack. Foreign ambassadors were essentially licensed spies whose primary job was to observe and report every detail about the monarchs they were sent to study. These weren't casual observers writing occasional letters home. They were trained intelligence operatives who sent regular, detailed dispatches analyzing everything they saw. They studied the Queen's appearance at every public function, noting any changes in her complexion, her energy level, her physical bearing, her mental sharpness. They'd describe how she moved, how she spoke, whether she seemed tired or ill or distracted. These reports would reach their home governments within days or weeks, depending on distance, and kings and ministers would read them carefully, looking for any advantage or opportunity. If Elizabeth appeared at court with visible signs of illness or disfigurement, it would be in every royal court in Europe within a month. Spain would start calculating whether now was the time to strike. France would begin positioning itself to take advantage of England's weakness. Scotland would start making succession plans. The Holy Roman Empire would consider its options. Elizabeth's own ministers would begin quiet discussions about contingency plans for her death or incapacity. The international implications of her appearance were enormous, which meant she had to maintain the mask of perfect health and eternal youth, even as her body was failing and her face was rotting beneath the makeup. She was trapped between two equally deadly options: continue poisoning herself to maintain the illusion of invincibility, or stop the poison and accept immediate political vulnerability that could destroy everything she'd built. January 1603 marked a turning point that everyone at court recognized as the beginning of the end. For the first time in 45 years, Elizabeth stopped wearing the ceruse. She simply stopped. Her ladies-in-waiting were absolutely horrified when she gave the order. This had been the daily routine for so long that it defined their mourning schedule and their understanding of how their queen should appear. Without the white mask, everyone would see the reality beneath, and the reality was monstrous. But Elizabeth had reached a point where she didn't care anymore, where the effort of maintaining the mask was more than she could bear. "I am past caring what they see," she reportedly told one of her ladies when pressed about the decision. Let them look. This wasn't liberation or freedom. This was surrender. This was a woman so exhausted by decades of performance and pain that she simply gave up on the pretense. Her face without the makeup was a horror show of lead poisoning's long-term effects. The black necrotic patches covered significant areas of her cheeks and forehead, looking like burns or acid damage. The red ulcerated areas wept constantly, requiring frequent dabbing with cloths. Her skin had a grayish, unhealthy pallor everywhere that wasn't blackened or inflamed, the color of tissue that's barely alive. The texture was rough and irregular, pitted with scars and permanent damage from decades of chemical assault. This is what 45 years of daily poison application had done to her face. This is what had been hiding beneath the beautiful white mask all along. With the mask gone, the other symptoms of advanced lead poisoning became more obvious and could no longer be attributed to temporary illness or minor indisposition. Elizabeth stopped eating almost entirely, not by choice, but because her damaged digestive system couldn't process food anymore. Her throat was swollen and painful, making swallowing agonizing. Her stomach had been so damaged by decades of lead-induced colic that it could barely tolerate even liquids. She managed small sips of broth when her ladies practically forced her to drink something. She'd take a few sips of wine to ease the pain and dull her senses. But solid food was completely beyond her capability. Her ladies tried everything, offering her favorite dishes, preparing special meals with the softest, blandest foods that might be easier to digest, begging her to eat something, anything, just a few bites to keep up her strength. She'd take one small bite, chew carefully, try to swallow, and then push the plate away, clutching her stomach and shaking her head. The pain was too much. The nausea was overwhelming. Her body was shutting down and food had become poison to her just as surely as the makeup had been. Starvation accelerated all her other symptoms. Without nutrition, her body had no resources to fight the accumulated toxins or attempt any kind of healing. Her muscles wasted away, making her even weaker. Her immune system collapsed, leaving her vulnerable to every infection and illness. Her already damaged organs struggled even harder without the nutrients they needed to function. Then came the grotesque abdominal swelling that marked the final stage of her body's complete systemic failure. Over the last weeks of her life, Elizabeth's abdomen began expanding dramatically, swelling larger and larger until she looked approximately 6 months pregnant. The irony was cruel beyond measure and seemed almost deliberately malicious. The Virgin Queen, who had spent her entire 44-year reign refusing marriage, rejecting motherhood, and making her virginity into a powerful political symbol, now appeared pregnant as she lay dying. The symbolism haunted everyone who witnessed it. Here was a woman who could never have children, whose entire political identity was built around remaining unmarried and childless, whose supposed purity and sacrifice for England had been the foundation of her mystique. And in death, her body was mocking her with the appearance of pregnancy. The medical reality was probably ascites, fluid accumulation in the abdominal cavity that happens when the liver and kidneys fail completely. When your kidneys can't filter waste and your liver can't process toxins, fluid backs up into your body with nowhere to go. It collects in the peritoneal cavity, the space inside your abdomen, creating grotesque swelling that can make you look pregnant, even when you're not. Elizabeth's kidneys had been damaged by decades of lead exposure. Her liver had been compressed and displaced by her corset for 45 years and poisoned by lead for just as long. Both organs were failing simultaneously, and the fluid was the visible result of that failure. But there's another possibility that fits with lead poisoning specifically. Lead deposits preferentially in certain tissues, and one of those tissues is the intestinal lining, where it can cause masses and growths. Chronic lead exposure can result in the development of tumors or significant scar tissue in the abdomen that would cause visible swelling even apart from fluid accumulation. Elizabeth might have had both fluid and tumors, creating that dramatic pregnancy-like appearance that shocked her attendants. Whatever the exact cause, the swelling represented her body's complete inability to function normally anymore. Every system was failing. Every organ was damaged beyond repair. The lead that had accumulated over 45 years had finally won, destroying her from the inside out. She couldn't eat, couldn't process waste, couldn't maintain proper fluid balance, couldn't think clearly, couldn't stand or walk without help. She was dying in slow motion, and everyone watching knew there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The poison had been building in her system for so long that it was now everywhere, in her bones, her brain, her organs, her blood. Stopping the external application of ceruse now couldn't save her because the poison was already inside, a permanent part of her body's structure, killing her cell by cell. And then came the strangest symptom of all, the detail that confused and terrified everyone around her more than anything else. Elizabeth refused to go to bed for nearly 2 weeks at the very end, and this bizarre behavior became the defining feature of her final days. Her doctors begged her to lie down and rest properly. Her counselors pleaded with her to preserve what little strength she had left. Her ladies tried every argument they could conceive to persuade her to accept the bed. She absolutely refused. She would sit in chairs propped up with cushions. She would lean against enormous piles of cushions heaped on the floor, practically buried in them. She would let her exhausted ladies hold her upright when she could no longer support herself, but she would not lie down in that bed. Days passed like this, then a week, then 2 weeks. Her ladies took turns supporting her, holding her up, trying to make her comfortable in these bizarre positions. They couldn't understand why she was doing this, what fear or delusion was driving this refusal. When they asked her directly why she wouldn't lie down and rest properly, Elizabeth gave different answers at different times, none of them entirely coherent. "Once I lie in that bed, I shall never rise again," she said at one point, expressing a superstitious fear that the bed represented final surrender to death. Another time she told them the bed is a trap. Death waits there, as if the physical location had become associated with dying in her confused, failing mind. Sometimes she just shook her head violently when they mentioned the bed and refused to speak about it at all, becoming agitated if they pressed the issue. Was this psychological, a dying woman's desperate attempt to maintain some illusion of control over her fate? Was it medical, perhaps lying flat, put unbearable pressure on her fluid-filled abdomen, or made breathing impossible with her damaged lungs? Or was it delirium, her lead-poisoned brain misfiring completely, creating irrational fears and impulses that made no logical sense? We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that on March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth Tudor finally stopped breathing after 44 years of ruling England and 45 years of poisoning herself daily for that privilege. When they finally prepared her body for burial, the true horror of what the mask had done was revealed in all its grotesque detail. As her ladies tried to remove any remaining traces of ceruse from her corpse, the makeup didn't wash off cleanly. It came away in sheets, large chunks of hardened paste that had fused with her destroyed flesh. When they pulled the makeup away, it literally peeled off her skin with it, layers of dead tissue coming away attached to the hardened ceruse. Where healthy dead skin should be pale and relatively normal, Elizabeth's face was a landscape of horror. Black patches of necrotic tissue covered much of her cheeks and forehead, looking like third-degree burns. Red, ulcerated areas that had been weeping infected fluid were now exposed. The smell of rotting flesh was overwhelming in the closed chamber, so intense that one lady-in-waiting vomited and had to be escorted from the room immediately. The attending servants were given explicit orders right then. Speak of nothing you see here. Nothing. They wrapped her body quickly, layer after layer of treated cloth covering the evidence. Then they placed her in a lead coffin, a container made from the same substance that had killed her, and sealed it within hours while her body was still warm. The coffin was rushed into Westminster Abbey and placed in its vault faster than was customary. And there she remains to this day, entombed in lead, her secrets buried with her for 400 years. The woman who wore a mask of lead died imprisoned by that same poison, and was sealed forever in a coffin of lead, unable to escape even in death the substance that defined and destroyed her life. If you want to see more hidden historical truths that challenge everything you thought you knew, subscribe to this channel right now, because we're uncovering the dark realities behind famous figures that textbooks deliberately hide. Drop a comment below telling us which historical beauty standards you want us to expose next, and smash that like button if you believe the truth about how vanity and politics literally poisoned one of history's most powerful women deserves to be told. The mask came off 400 years ago, and it's time the whole world saw what was underneath.